So I've been playing Persona 4 for a few months now. I'm about 2/3 of the way through the game and I've enjoyed almost every second of it. The story is extremely compelling, the social link system is the coolest thing since sliced bread, the soundtrack is banging with beautifully catchy pieces, the writing and dialogue is spectacular, the voice acting is top notch, it looks gorgeous, the characters are awesome. This game is nothing short of a masterpiece and it deserves every bit of praise it gets. However, I did say I've enjoyed almost every second of it, and I don't know how controversial this take might be, as I've been keeping myself in the dark so I can form my own opinion on the game, but after the time I've spent playing it so far, I think I can provide a solid case for myself, so I'm just gonna say it. The battle mechanics in Persona 4 aren't the greatest. Let me reiterate, everything else about the game, love it to death. I played it about 8 hours straight one time, but when it comes to the battle mechanics, it just doesn't do it for me. So please, sit back, hold all comments until the end of the video, and allow me to tell you why I feel this way. Also, I will only be showing the first 2 dungeons to prevent huge spoilers, and the credit to whose footage I've borrowed is in the description below. Alright, let's do this. Firstly though, I'm going to go over the basics of battling very briefly. While traversing through dungeons, you'll come across shadows. Attack it to initiate a battle. Attacking it from the back gives you an advantage. But if you get attacked from the back, the shadows get an advantage. Once in a battle, you can pick from a list of skills that you or your party member's persona knows. Including you, there will always be 4 people in your party when going through the dungeon. Other party members can either be given commands directly or can act on their own accord. The battle ends when either all of the shadows are defeated or you are defeated yourself. And that was basically the basics. When making a claim as bold as I have, it's important to go over what the battle system does right, as it does do a lot of good things. Having a large list of personas at your disposal, each with their own stats and skills, provides great diversity to the gameplay. You get to constantly try out new strategies, take a different tactic into each battle. This, along with the fact that you're able to switch personas once per turn, makes it to where you're most likely going to be prepared for every fight you go into. The personas being as well designed as they are is also a plus. I also love how the social link system is intertwined with the battle system. The higher the social link you have with a party member means better skills the member's persona learns, and if the person has a social link but isn't a party member, then the personas a part of the arcana that they represent will become more powerful. Arcanas are essentially the groups that the personas are sorted into. This connection between the two systems does a great job encouraging the player to experience as much of the game as possible. Depending on how good you do in one part of the game will affect how well you do at the other. If you go through the days without building any social links, firstly, what's wrong with you? And secondly, you're going to have a much harder time when it comes to traversing dungeons. So having these systems be interconnected adds a nice extra layer to both sides of the game. And finally, I like the rush system. When you don't want to waste SP and can get away with constantly attacking, at the press of a button, the characters will take turns dishing out damage until all the shadows are dead. It's great when running through dungeons you've already beaten, and it eliminates the hassle of mashing the A button over and over until all the enemies fall down. An RPG practice that no doubt gets tedious very quickly. Alrighty, that's what I think the battle system does right. Now let's get into what I think the battle system does wrong. So the first problem I want to make note of is how the game treats the main character when battling. If you remember back to when I briefly went over the game's mechanics, I said the battle ends when either all shadows are defeated or you are defeated yourself. So if the main character dies in battle, it's game over. When hearing it, it might not sound like that big of a deal, but in my opinion, this is a very prevalent flaw. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're almost done with clearing a floor in a dungeon when a shadow is able to strike you with a critical hit, knocking you out. Now, even though you could have all 3 party members alive and well, too bad, you gotta redo the whole floor all over again. Now, this may seem like such an unlikely occurrence, but there are 8 dungeons in the game, with almost all of them having 11 floors apiece, where you will be fighting between a dozen and half a dozen shadows on each floor. It will happen to you, and it will happen more than once. I understand why they do this is to prevent the battle from becoming an AI-controlled slog in the case that you've made all the other party members act on their own accord, but this could have easily been eliminated if the game just had you control them automatically after your character dies. This makes every every battle be ever so slightly unpredictable, and not in a good way. I feel like I always have to play it extremely safe, and that does make the battles drag out more than I like to. It also makes critical hits way more of a pain, because not only does it knock you down, but it also gives the shadow who got the critical an extra turn. That goes for you too, but when a shadow gets it off, it just feels all the more BS, especially if they get an advantage at the start. Like I mentioned previously, if you attack a shadow's back, you get to go first, but if you get attacked from behind yourself, they get an advantage. This means that if you make a mistake and they get the advantage, there's a chance they can just cripple you on your first turn and give you nothing to work with. Imagine if in Final Fantasy VII you got a game over when only Cloud died, or if you blacked out in Pokemon when just your starter fainted. Pretty irritating, right? I think so. It causes you to over-prioritize your main character, which kind of ends up leaving every other party member in the dust. Speaking of the advantage system, it also has some noteworthy problems. Firstly, even when neither you or the shadow get an advantage, more often than not, the shadows are going to go first anyway, meaning you could still get crippled right out the gate, much like you would if they did get an advantage. This forces the player to always get an advantage for every battle, which drags out the dungeon crawl, because you'll more than half the time be standing around waiting for a shadow to turn the other way so you can smack them. It gets tedious, and sometimes the shadows will even get stuck and won't turn. Moving away from advantages, but sticking with the shadows here, weaknesses and resistances are a big part of the gameplay, naturally, as it is an RPG, but when it comes to the shadows here, what their weaknesses are won't always make sense. For example, the Forgotten Halberry, this monstrosity, is weak to ice. How does the player figure that out? Experimentation. The game encourages, no, outright requires you to experiment to find the weaknesses of the shadows. Now, this is fine for the beginning of the game, but later on, when enemies can hit for truckloads of damage, you won't exactly have the time to do any experimentation at all, especially when you have to deal with shadows that resist certain skills, block them, reflect the damage back onto you, or straight up gain health if you use the wrong skill. Those factors, combined with the fact that shadows can hit your weakness as well, which also gives them an extra turn as it does for you, and you have a battle system that promotes experimentation but doesn't complement that playstyle at the same time. And good luck trying to commit all the weaknesses to memory, because there's so many shadows, it's nearly impossible to do. Now, the game does lessen this flaw by giving you the ability to see what the skill will do to the shadow beforehand, but that's a decent way into the game, and it creates another problem in sifting through the menu, checking every skill to see which one the shadow is weak to, which adds another layer of drag to the battles. I've gotten around this though by simply looking up the list of shadows and their weaknesses, but the fact that I have to turn to an outside source to eliminate a problem with the game, that's a flaw. This, along with the advantage system, makes every battle play out pretty much the same way. Wait for the shadow to turn around, look up the weaknesses, hit them hard until they're all down, pile on, heal up after the fight, rinse and repeat for every fight on every floor of every dungeon. It becomes repetitive pretty fast. Now, at least the shadows have weaknesses. The same, however, cannot be said for a lot of the bosses. Good transition, easy. The bosses are another issue I have with the battle system, at least the ones mandatory for story progression. The bosses are where all of my problems with battling join forces to create a slow, boring, and artificially difficult fight. Not only do the bosses have no weaknesses, they also aren't afflicted by any status ailments. Panic, fear, silence, exhaustion, rage, poison, none of them work. This eliminates so many possible strategies you could have going into the fight. Did you want to whittle it down with poison damage? Sorry, it's just not possible. Maybe inflict the boss with silence so they can't use any skills. Too bad, because it literally won't happen. Honest question here for anyone who has made it this far. What is the reason for this? Genuinely curious, because it's not like it would break these bosses in half. You afflict it with one status ailment at a time, it wears off after a few turns, each boss has a stupid high amount of health, and later on, bosses can move twice per turn. I can sort of understand the bosses having no weaknesses, because if the boss were, say, weak to ice, you could just have Chie and Teddy use their ice skills over and over again, being able to pile on each time after. That could make each boss a pushover, but you could easily fix that by just not having the boss get knocked down, have it take the extra damage from weakness, but prevent the pile-on. Simple fix. The only skills that realistically do make sense to nullify on the bosses is the one-hit kill moves, because That would just make every boss simply reset if you don't get it until you do get it. Much like normal battles, this makes boss fights play out pretty much all the same way, just evolving into slowly and methodically chipping their health away while healing yourself. No real strategy. It gets even worse when you come across a couple bosses that can just use every type of skill, meaning they can always hit your weaknesses, but you literally can't do the same. It's not challenging because it's actually hard, it's challenging because it's tedious and draining. Without a doubt, the boss fights are my least favorite part of the game, as they represent everything I've stated in this video into one poorly done package. At least they're designed cool. Not only are they tedious, but they're long too. They can take up to half an hour sometimes of just doing the same thing over and over and over again, because the game doesn't let you try anything different. There's even a dungeon where you have to fight 2 bosses back to back, and it's a complete drag. The dungeon and normal fights as well, it just drags a lot of the time. And that's all I really have to say. The battle mechanics just aren't that good, but I don't want to end this video on a downer. Persona 4 is an amazing game. Seriously, don't let what I said turn you away if you haven't played it, please, because you would be missing out on one of the greatest stories ever told in gaming, and there is just so much to love in this game that it almost completely drowns out the negatives I presented. Almost. But hey, that's just me. What do you think of the battle mechanics in Persona 4, and how solid do you think my case was? I think it's very solid, but everyone has a preference. So with that all said, I'm Easily Easy, and I'll see you next time.